Hello everyone, my name is Will Carrera, and today I'm going to be presenting my third video assignment, Changing Gender Norms in Romance. So my main argument, or my stance rather, is that while tremendous strides towards true romantic freedom have taken place during modern history, there is still a very far way to go. So I thought I would kind of give a brief history of gender roles and expectations for heterosexual women, as heterosexuality is what we deem normal here in US culture. So in the early 1900s, men were expected to be breadwinners of the family and authority figures, while women were often forced into domestic roles. This is something that we still see today, but it was especially evident at that time period. Women had very limited legal rights and few professional opportunities, as evident they couldn't vote until 1920. And a little side note, women's clothing of the time emphasized modesty, while men's emphasized professionalism. Things such as tailored suits were commonplace during that time period. In the 1930s and 40s, during the Great Depression, we saw kind of a breakdown of these traditional gender norms as women were seeking work to support their families during these trying times, and with World War II as well. Many men went to go fight in the war, while women were forced to take those industrial jobs that were left behind. With the 1950s, we saw kind of a return of the traditional gender roles with the introduction of like the traditional nuclear family. So, a husband, a wife, two kids, picket fence, that sort of deal. In the 1960s and 1970s, we saw many feminist movements that challenged traditional gender norms, advocating for things such as reproductive rights and equal pay. The 1980s, we saw an increase of educated women entering the workforce, despite still facing things such as the wage gap, which still exists today, unfortunately. And we saw an increase in media representation during that time as well. So, what do these gender roles mean for heterosexual romance? So, in more recent history, through the changes of gender roles, we're seeing women are holding more social power, which drastically changes the relationship dynamics that were put in place many years prior. Also, in more recent history, we're seeing a push for more open communication around sex on both sides. So, male to female, female to male, we're seeing a push for the communication to be more open. And we can kind of compare this to the dynamic of the 50s through like the 80s. As we discussed in class, communication about sex and things such as casual sex were not common at that time. As table 2.3 from the Radway Romances reading exemplifies to like a T. During that time period, a survey was taken from about 50 women who kind of grew up under that nuclear family model, and no woman objected to the fact that the hero has to be stronger than the heroine in romance novels. So that just kind of exemplifies exactly those traditional norms, kind of going back to our gender schemas. The way you grow up kind of influences how you perceive the world, excuse me. So the shift in power dynamics has drastically changed romance in recent years as a result of all these things. So moving on, it's now time we talk about the representation of the LGBTQ community and other marginalized people in society. Homosexuality was criminalized for much of the 20th century, with the fundamental right to marry only being awarded in 2015. As the documentary The Gender Code outlines, homosexuality was viewed as a disease, and transgender people were not understood at all, as this video exemplifies.
That looks innocent enough, doesn't it? Lots of young people hitchhike. Seems like a good way to get from one place to another. But sometimes there are dangers involved that never meet the eye. So no matter where you meet a stranger, be careful if they are too friendly. One never knows when the homosexual is about. Let's take the case of Jimmy Barnes. Jimmy played baseball all afternoon, and he didn't feel like walking home, so he decided to thumb a ride. He'd done it 100 times before, and he didn't think anything was unusual when the driver struck up a friendly conversation. In fact, he seemed like a real nice guy. What Jimmy didn't know was that Ralph was sick, a sickness that was not visible like smallpox, but no less dangerous and contagious, a sickness of the mind. You see, Ralph was a homosexual, a person who demands an intimate relationship with members of their own sex. So no matter what
So that video was filmed in, I believe, 1961, which in the grand scheme of the world is not that long ago. It's pretty crazy to see how the media portrayed homosexuals at that time. I also feel like it's beneficial just to give a brief history of gender nonconformity in America. So in the early 1900s, homosexuality was widely criminalized. We saw many violent attacks during this time, and many decades later as well. It was deemed a mental illness, and they were forced to socialize in secret as a result of all this. In the 1940s and 50s, we saw a few small movements arise advocating for change, but in the public eye, this was still very outlandish. In the 1970s, we see the LGBTQ movement gaining momentum. Harvey Milk, he became the first openly gay political figure and was unfortunately murdered in San Francisco. The 1980s, we saw the AIDS epidemic, which struck fear in the public eye surrounding gay individuals, um, which is very unfortunate. In the later 2000s, we saw the legality of gay marriage and other legal rights leaning more towards gay individuals in the LGBTQ community. So, what does this mean for romance? So, there was almost a complete lack of social acceptance until very recently. Like I previously mentioned, gay marriage wasn't awarded until 2015. Many people were forced to live in secret. There was many violent attacks. They were blamed for an entire medical crisis. And then they've only begun recently expanding horizons in the LGBTQ community. So, long story short, romance has been extremely difficult for many different communities that do not fit into the heterosexual norm that the US deems normal. So, kind of my last talking point for this assignment. So, social media and romantic expression. So, it's no secret that social media has changed the way that we communicate. It's through social media that we are identifying additional marginalized groups, such as the one outlined in the gender code, consisting of a lack of language and representation for males who are into trans women. It's through social media, however, that a change in culture is more easily accessible than prior decades. Communication was not as widespread, it was harder to get in touch with people. And as Luca Keating, the creator of this documentary, states, towards the end of the documentary, she states that social media is breaking the old ways to a time when we can define our own place on the spectrum. So it's just kind of bringing more awareness to these marginalized groups and advocating for social change. And social media is a giant part of that and romantic expression. So yeah, that's all I have. Here's my references. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen.